There is a place on this earth where the day does not end abruptly. It does not slam shut like a door. It does not cut off like a signal lost in the middle of a sentence. Instead, it dissolves slowly, gently, the way sugar disappears into warm water. You do not see the exact moment it is gone. You only notice, after a while, that the light has become something softer, something quieter, something that asks nothing of you at all. That place is the Sea of Galilee. And tonight, we are going there together. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Something that has nothing to do with theology or doctrine or the right answers. Just tell me right now. Wherever you are, what city are you in tonight? And what time does your clock say? Type it in the comments below. Because you are not alone in this moment. And I want to know where in the world you are listening from as we step into this story together. Now, if you can, set your phone gently to one side, or let it rest in your hand like something you no longer need to grip so tightly. Find a position that is comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your back sink a little deeper into wherever you are lying or sitting. There is nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to figure out. The night has already begun, and it is asking you very kindly to let go. Take a breath, and let me take you somewhere 2,000 years away. The Sea of Galilee sits in the northern region of ancient Israel, cradled between rolling hills and the quiet expanse of the Jordan Valley. It is not the largest body of water in the world. It is not even the largest in that region. But there is something about it, something in the way the hills curve around it, like cupped hands. Something in the way the water catches the last light of evening that makes it feel like the whole world could be contained within its shores. In the time of Jesus, this lake was not a scenic destination. It was a workplace. It was a kitchen table. It was the source of livelihood for dozens of fishing families who had worked its waters for generations, passing down the knowledge of its moods and currents, the way other families pass down recipes or prayers. The men who lived along its shores knew which way the wind came down from the northern hills in the late afternoon. They knew the smell of rain before the clouds arrived. They knew how the water changed color when the temperature shifted from a clear, pale green in the shallows to a deep and somber blue toward the center. By late afternoon, the fishermen would begin preparing, not with urgency, not with the frenzy of people trying to outrun the dark, but with the quiet, unhurried competence of those who have done this 1,000 times. Nets would be inspected and mended, stretched out along the dock to dry in the last warmth of the sun. Boats would be pushed back into the shallows, their wooden hulls dark with water, smelling of fish and pine resin and the particular earthiness of lake mud. Children would run along the water's edge, kicking up small splashes, their voices carrying across the surface and echoing faintly off the far hills. And slowly, the light would begin to change. The sun in that region sets with a kind of ceremony. It does not simply drop below the horizon. It lingers. It spreads itself out across the western sky in long, horizontal strokes of color, first a pale gold, then amber, then a deep and dusty rose. The hills on the western shore would catch this light and hold it, glowing for a few minutes longer than everything else, like embers after a fire has been banked for the night. And then, gradually, the color would drain away, and the sky would deepen into the particular shade of blue that exists only in the last minutes before true dark, not quite night. Not quite day, but something in between. Something that belongs to neither world and somehow belongs to both. The first stars would appear before you expected them. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a single point of light in the east. So faint, you were not sure you had seen it. And then another, and then another, until, almost without your noticing, the sky was full. The people who lived along the shores of Galilee in those days were not wealthy people. They were not powerful people. They did not appear in the history books of Rome or Greece. They were fishermen and farmers, tax collectors and tradespeople, mothers who ground grain before dawn, and fathers who came home with aching backs and salt-dried skin. They worshipped in the synagogue on the Sabbath, observed the festivals as their fathers had observed them, argued about the finer points of the law over evening meals, and fell asleep to the sound of water lapping against the dock. Their houses were simple: stone walls, low ceilings, floors of packed earth or rough-cut stone, a central room for cooking and eating, smaller rooms at the back for sleeping, oil lamps burning in the evening with a small, steady flame that cast warm shadows across the walls. Bread baking on flat stones near the fire, the smell of olive oil and wood smoke, and the herbs that grew in the courtyard outside. Life was not easy for these people, but it had a rhythm. And rhythm, it turns out, is one of the most soothing things in the world. There is something deeply calming about a life organized around the natural movements of the day, the rising and setting of the sun, the coming and going of the tides, the seasons rotating through their changes with patient, unhurried certainty. These ancient rhythms do not ask for productivity. They do not require you to optimize or hustle or perform. They simply move, and they invite you to move with them at their pace. By the time full dark had settled over the lake, the docks were quiet. The boats rested in the shallows, rocking gently in the small waves that came and went without reason. The nets hung drying on their poles, swaying slightly in the night breeze. The cooking fires in the houses had been banked down to glowing coals. The children had been tucked into their mats, their small bodies curled like sleeping animals, their breathing already slow and deep. The dogs lay near the doorways. The donkeys stood in the courtyard, their eyes half closed, dreaming of whatever donkeys dream. And overhead, the stars continued their patient rotation, turning slowly around the fixed point of the North Star, as they had done since before there were eyes to watch them. It was into this world, this ancient, unhurried, lakeside world, that Jesus came to call his disciples. Several of them were fishermen. Peter and his brother Andrew had worked these waters since they were boys. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, knew every current and eddy of this lake. When Jesus called them, they did not leave behind careers or offices or carefully constructed life plans. They left their nets. They left their boats. They left the world they had always known, the reliable, repetitive, salty-smelling world of the lake, and followed someone who spoke about the kingdom of God as if he had been there and come back to describe it. They were not scholars. Most of them. They were not trained theologians. They were ordinary people, people who knew the weight of wet rope and the ache of a bad night's catch. People who worried about the same things you worry about: money, family, the future, whether things would work out. People who sometimes said the wrong thing, made the wrong choice, misunderstood what was right in front of them. In other words, people very much like us. And on a certain evening, after a long day of teaching by the shore, a day when the crowds had pressed in close, and the sun had been relentless, and the words had kept coming, and the needs had kept multiplying, Jesus looked at his disciples and said something that must have felt, in that moment, like the kindest words he could have spoken. He said, "Let us go to the other side." That was it. No grand announcement. No theological preamble. Just let us go. Let us cross over. Let us leave this shore and go to the other one. The disciples began to make ready the boat. The evening air was cooling now. The water had that particular stillness it sometimes found at the end of a warm day. Smooth and dark and quietly reflective, showing fragments of the rising stars scattered across its surface like a mosaic made of light. The shore behind them was gradually receding, the voices of the crowd growing faint. The oil lamps in the houses becoming small, warm points in the distance, like earthbound stars. Ahead of them was the open water. Ahead of them was the night. And somewhere in the stern of that boat, Jesus found a cushion, settled himself against the wooden ribs of the hull, and closed his eyes. He was, within moments, asleep. We will stay with that image for a moment before we continue. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is the opposite of dramatic. And that, strangely enough, is exactly what makes it so powerful. The Son of God, asleep in a boat. Not anxious, not watchful, not braced for what might come. Just sleeping. There is a kind of rest that can only come from complete trust. Not the rest of someone who has numbed themselves to danger. Not the rest of someone who does not care what happens. But the rest of someone who knows, down to the deepest part of their being, that they are held. That the outcome is not resting on their shoulders. That even the wind and the sea, even the things that feel most wild and most uncontrollable, belong to the one who made them. That kind of rest is real. And tonight, as you begin to feel your own body grow heavier. As the sounds of your day begin to fade and the edges of your thoughts begin to soften, that is the rest you are being invited into. Not because your storms are over, but because the same one who slept in that boat is in yours. Let the stars above you multiply. Let the water carry the boat. Let the night do what the night was made to do. We are just beginning. Nobody steps into a boat with an empty heart. That is something worth sitting with for a moment, especially tonight. Especially right now, as you are lying in the quiet and the dark. And the day is finally, mercifully behind you. Because even now, even in this stillness, there is probably something you carried with you into this night. A worry you could not set down. A conversation that replayed itself too many times. A decision that does not yet have an answer. A fear that has no name but takes up space anyway. Like a guest who arrived without being invited and has not yet found the door. You know the feeling. You have been here before lying still. Body tired. Mind still moving. The room is quiet, but your thoughts are not. The lights are off, but something inside you has not yet learned to stop. This is not a new human problem. It is, in fact, an ancient one. The disciples who climbed into that boat on the evening we are following, they were tired in a way that went deeper than the body. It had been a long day. A very long day. Jesus had spent hours by the water's edge, teaching, not in the soft, unhurried manner of a man with nowhere to be, but with the kind of sustained, pouring out energy that teaching requires when you are doing it honestly. When you are truly trying to reach people rather than simply performing in front of them. The crowds had gathered early and stayed late. People pressed in from every direction from the towns along the shore, from the villages in the hills, from places farther away whose names we do not know. They came with questions, with needs, with their own invisible weights. They came hoping something would shift. And the disciples had been in the middle of all of it. Not just observers, participants, managing the crowds, fielding questions, watching and listening, and trying to understand what Jesus was doing and saying and meaning. And often, if we are honest, not quite understanding it fully. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being present to something larger than yourself and not being entirely sure what your role in it is. A kind of alert, effortful attention that uses up a quiet part of you that rest alone cannot fully restore. By the time the evening came, they were spent, and now they were in a boat, heading across open water in the dark. Let us think about who these men were. For a moment. Peter, the one who would one day become a cornerstone of the early church, was, on this particular evening, still very much a fisherman, with a fisherman's instincts and a fisherman's worries. He knew this lake. He had grown up on it. He had pulled nets from it in every season and in every kind of weather. He knew what the sky looked like before a bad storm. He knew the particular quality of silence that sometimes descended before the wind came howling down from the Golan Heights to the north and turned the lake from a smooth, dark mirror into something angry and unpredictable. That knowledge was not reassuring tonight. It was, if anything, the source of a low hum of unease he carried behind his ribs as the boat moved out from the shore. Andrew, his brother, would have felt something similar, that fisherman's sixth sense. The kind that does not announce itself as fear, but simply makes the body a little more alert than usual. The eyes moving a little more often toward the northern horizon. James and John, two the sons of Zebedee, who had once competed for the best seats in the coming kingdom. They were quieter tonight than usual. The water had that late evening flatness that sometimes preceded a change in the weather. They had seen it before. And the others, Matthew, who had been a tax collector before all of this began, who had sat in a booth by the road counting coins for Rome and had one day looked up to find Jesus standing in front of him, saying, "Simply follow me." He had a different kind of weight. Not the weather reader's unease, but the weight of a man who had upended his entire life for something he believed in, and still, on certain quiet evenings, found himself wondering what exactly he had done, whether he had been foolish, whether this road led somewhere real. These are not shameful thoughts. They are human thoughts. And every one of us has had them lying awake in the dark, wondering if we made the right choices, wondering if the thing we gave our lives to is actually as solid as it looked in the daylight. There is a particular kind of anxiety that visits only at night. During the day, there are things to do. There are tasks and errands and conversations and the small, useful frictions of ordinary life that fill the hours and keep the mind occupied. But at night, when the tasks are done and the house is quiet and there is nothing left to distract you, the things you have been out running all day finally catch up. The worry about the future that you pushed aside at breakfast. The uncertainty about the relationship that you filled with busyness all afternoon. The sense that something is not quite right. That something important is unresolved. That the ground beneath your life is not as stable as you need it to be. At night, these things grow larger. Not because they have actually grown, but because everything else has gotten smaller. And now there is nothing to stand between you and them. The disciples in that boat were not so different from you tonight. They had the same basic human equipment, the same nervous systems that misread silence as threat, the same imaginations that filled uncertain futures with worst-case scenarios, the same hearts that clenched involuntarily when the wind picked up, or the water darkened, or the shore grew too far away to swim back to. They were afraid of the things they could not control. And they were on a boat in the middle of a lake at night, which is not exactly the ideal environment for a person struggling with the need for control. But here is what I want you to notice. Before we go any further, they got in the boat anyway. Whatever they felt, whatever quiet anxiety was threading itself through their chests as the shore receded, they did not say, actually, "You know what? This seems like a bad idea. Let us stay here where it is safe." They did not negotiate for a smaller risk or a more comfortable arrangement. They picked up the oars and they pushed off from the shore, and they went. Not because they had conquered their fear, not because they had figured everything out, but because he said, "Let us go to the other side," and somehow, that was enough. This is worth remembering on the nights when you are afraid. Courage, in the biblical sense, has never meant the absence of fear. It has always meant the decision to move anyway, to step onto the water when your legs are shaking, to climb into the boat when the sky looks uncertain, to keep going when every instinct in your body is telling you to find somewhere safer to wait this out. The disciples were afraid, and they got in the boat. There is another weight that I want to name tonight, because I think it is the one that goes deepest. It is the weight of carrying things that were never meant to be carried alone. Most of the burdens we lose sleep over the relationships that are strained, the futures that are uncertain, the decisions that feel too large for us, the fears that have no clean resolution. Most of them share a common root. They are things we have picked up and are trying to hold by ourselves. Things we were never designed to bear solo. Things that require a strength we do not possess and a knowledge we do not have, and a view of the future that belongs only to someone who actually knows how the story ends. We were not built to carry the weight of tomorrow tonight. And yet we try. Every night, we try. We rehearse conversations that have not happened. We plan responses to disasters that may never arrive. We lie in bed running calculations on uncertainties that have too many variables to solve. We squeeze our minds around problems that will not yield to squeezing. And we call this thinking. And we tell ourselves that if we just think hard enough, we will find the answer that will let us finally relax. But the answer never comes. Not that way. The disciples in that boat had their own version of this weight. There were things about the future they did not know about where this journey with Jesus was heading, about what it would cost them, about whether the kingdom he kept speaking of would actually arrive in the way they hoped. There were things they could not yet understand and could not yet resolve. And they were carrying all of it into the dark water, in a wooden boat, with the stars overhead and the shores disappearing behind them. And yet, there was one among them who was not carrying any of it. He had already let it go. He had already laid it down, or rather, he had never picked it up in the way the rest of us do. Not because the weight was not real, not because the coming night held no storms, but because he knew something about who held the water and who breathed the wind into being, and who had already seen the other shore before the boat ever left the dock. He was asleep. We will come to that in the next chapter, that extraordinary image of rest in the middle of uncertainty. But for now, as you feel your own body growing heavier and your own breathing beginning to slow, I want to ask you something, gently. What did you carry into tonight? What is sitting in the bottom of your boat right now, taking up space, making you a little more tense than you need to be? You do not have to solve it tonight. You do not have to figure it out before you can sleep. You only have to know this one thing. You are not the only one in this boat. The same one who spoke to the fishermen on the shore, who called them by name, who saw through their questions to the longing underneath, who knew their fears before they named them. He is here too. He has been here the whole time, quieter than you expected, closer than you realized. And he is not worried. Let that settle into you like warmth. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let the weight of tomorrow wait until tomorrow. The boat is moving. The water is dark and calm beneath you. The stars are out, and we are not alone. There is something I want you to notice before I say anything else. Not the storm, not the waves, not the fear in the disciples' eyes. I want you to notice the cushion. Mark's Gospel, the 4th chapter, records a detail that is so small, so quiet and weighty, that it is easy to read right past it. But I think it might be the most important detail in the entire story. When the storm comes, when the water begins rising into the boat, when the wind turns the surface of the Sea of Galilee into something violent and unpredictable, Jesus is asleep. And Mark tells us specifically, he was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. A cushion. Someone had thought to bring a cushion onto the boat. Perhaps it was already there, tucked into the back of the vessel, the way fishermen keep their tools, organized ropes in this corner. Nets in that one, and a small folded cushion near the stern where a tired man might rest during a long crossing. Or perhaps someone had placed it there for him, quietly, without making a fuss. We don't know, but Mark remembered it. He wrote it down. And I think that cushion tells us something that the rest of the story only confirms. Jesus was not bracing himself for what was coming. He was not keeping one eye open. He was not in a light half-sleep, ready to spring into action the moment the wind shifted. He was resting, deeply, genuinely, with his head on a cushion in the stern of a small wooden boat on the Sea of Galilee, in the dark. Think about what that means. The Sea of Galilee is not a predictable body of water. The disciples knew this better than anyone. Several of them had spent their entire adult lives on those waters. Peter and Andrew. James and John, these were not men who had simply read about the sea. They had grown up breathing its air, reading its moods, learning to trust certain currents and distrust others. They had launched boats at dawn and pulled them back in at dusk. They had felt the way the water changed texture just before a storm arrived. The way the wind picked up first from the east, then shifted, then arrived from everywhere at once. The Sea of Galilee sits below sea level, surrounded on most sides by hills. When a wind comes down from those hills and meets the warm air rising off the water, it can transform the surface in what feels like minutes. Fishermen who worked those waters knew that a calm evening could become something terrifying with very little warning. This was not a myth or an exaggeration. It was simply the nature of the place. And yet, Jesus lay down in the stern of that boat, rested his head on a cushion, and went to sleep. There is a kind of peace in that image that I find almost impossible to fully describe. It is not the peace of ignorance. He was not unaware that they were on water. He was not naive about the nature of the sea. He had walked along those shores. He had watched storms gather over those hills. He understood, in his bones, what it meant to be a small wooden vessel on an unpredictable body of water in the middle of the night. And he slept anyway. I want to be careful here, because I think this is a moment in the story where it is easy to rush toward a lesson, to extract the meaning too quickly and miss what is actually being shown to us. So let's stay with this image a little longer. Let's just sit in the boat with him for a moment, in the quiet before the storm arrives. The evening light has faded. The shore of Capernaum has disappeared behind them. Around them, the other small boats that had set out at the same time are scattered across the darkening water. Each one a tiny lamp of lantern light moving slowly across the surface. The disciples are working adjusting the sail, reading the wind, talking quietly among themselves. There is the rhythmic sound of water against the hull, the low creak of the mast, the smell of fish and old rope and night air coming off the sea. And in the stern, Jesus sleeps. His breathing is slow and even. The rocking of the boat, which might keep a stranger awake, seems to have done the opposite for him, settled him, soothed him, carried him down into a rest that is complete and unguarded. His hands are loose at his sides. His face is still. What does it feel like to rest like that? I think most of us have forgotten. Or perhaps some of us have never quite known. There is a kind of sleep that most of us are familiar with. The kind where you are technically unconscious, but your body is still holding tension. Your jaw still clenched. Your mind still running through the list of things you are worried about, even as your eyes are closed. You wake from that kind of sleep already tired. You open your eyes, and the anxiety is there waiting for you, patient as ever, ready to pick up exactly where it left off. But the sleep that Jesus is sleeping in the stern of that boat is something different. It is the sleep of someone who has genuinely released something, not someone who has forced themselves to stop worrying. Not someone who has made a decision to appear calm while still, somewhere underneath, carrying a weight. This is the sleep of someone who has truly, completely given over the keeping of the world to someone else. There is a phrase I have thought about often in relation to this passage. It comes from the 121st Psalm, one of those ancient songs that the Hebrew people sang as they traveled toward Jerusalem on the great pilgrimage festivals. The psalmist writes, addressing God, "He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. He who watches over you does not sleep." And because of that, you can. That is the logic underneath the cushion. That is why Jesus can rest in the stern of a boat on a sea that is about to become violent. Not because he is indifferent to what might happen. Not because he is somehow above fear in a way that makes him unreachable. But because his trust in the one who holds all things is so complete, so deeply rooted, that rest is not something he has to fight for. It is something that comes naturally, the way a child falls asleep in the back seat of a car. Not because the road is smooth, but because they trust absolutely that someone who loves them is at the wheel. I think about the children in a family making a long journey through the night. The parents are awake, navigating, watching the road, and in the back seat, curled against each other. The children sleep not because there is no danger on the road, not because nothing could go wrong, but because the presence of those they love and trust creates a safety that is more powerful than circumstance. Their bodies know something that their minds don't have to consciously articulate. They are held. They can let go. Jesus, in the stern of that boat, is sleeping the sleep of a child who knows he is held. Now I want to gently turn this toward you, because I think this is where the story begins, to ask something of us. When was the last time you slept like that? Not the last time you were unconscious, but the last time you genuinely rested the way your body and your mind, and something deeper than both of them simply let go. Released. Entrusted the night and the morning and everything in between to someone whose care you did not doubt. For many of us, and I am, including myself in this, that kind of rest feels like a distant memory, or like something we read about, something that exists in theory, in the pages of devotional books and the sermons of people who seem to have figured something out that we haven't. The rest Jesus demonstrates in this passage is not a technique. It is not a sleep hygiene practice. It is not something you can achieve by downloading the right app or following the right routine. Though none of those things are bad. It is the fruit of trust. Deep, practiced, honest trust. And trust is not something that arrives all at once. It is built over time, through the accumulation of small experiences, moments when you let go of something and discovered that you were still held. Moments when the thing you feared did not destroy you. Moments when morning came and the mercy you had been promised was still there, as real and as steady as it had ever been. Trust is built the way a callus is built, slowly, through contact with the hard and the difficult, over and over again, until something that once caused pain begins to feel simply like the texture of a life being lived in good hands. The disciples had not yet built that trust. They were still in the early days of learning who Jesus was and what it meant to follow him. They had seen things that astonished them, healings, forgiveness, teaching unlike anything they had heard before. But they had not yet had the experience of a storm. And the storm, it turns out, is where a great deal of the trust building happens. I want to say something carefully, because I don't want to misrepresent the disciples or make them seem small. Their fear in this story is not a failure. It is not evidence of some deep spiritual deficiency. They are on a small wooden boat in the dark, in a storm, on water. Fear is a reasonable response. The fact that they woke Jesus, the fact that they went to him, that itself is a kind of faith. They may not have had the peace to sleep through the storm, but they knew where to turn when the storm arrived. That matters more than we sometimes give it credit for. There is a version of the Christian life that suggests the truly spiritual person never struggles, never fears, never lies awake at 3 a.m. with their chest tight and their mind spinning. I want to gently push back against that version of faith, because I do not think it is what the Bible actually shows us. What the Bible shows us is people, real, fully human people who are afraid, who are overwhelmed, who sometimes look at the circumstances around them and feel genuinely and completely that things are beyond their control. And then it shows us what happens when those people turn toward God in the middle of that. The disciples did not have the peace that Jesus had in the stern of the boat, but they knew where the peace was, and so they went there. Before the storm arrives in full, before the waves crash over the side and the panic sets in, let's linger here a moment longer in this image of Jesus asleep. It is nighttime. The Sea of Galilee is still relatively calm. The first hints of distant weather, not yet visible in the starless patches, beginning to appear at the edge of the horizon. The boat rocks gently. The disciples are quiet, tired after a long day of listening to Jesus teach from the shore, watching the crowds press in, trying to follow everything he said and file it away in minds, still trying to make sense of all of it. And at the back of the boat, Jesus sleeps. And somehow in the gently shifting dark, in the sound of water and the slow rock of the hull, that sleeping figure is the most peaceful thing in the world. There is a rabbi who once observed that the most powerful form of testimony is not an argument, but a demonstration. You can tell someone that God is trustworthy 1,000 times. You can write it in careful sentences, explain it from every angle, build the most airtight case imaginable. And there is value in that. But it will never have quite the same impact as watching someone live it, watching someone rest deeply in the middle of uncertainty, sleep soundly in the middle of a crossing that could become dangerous, remain unhurried and genuinely at peace in the presence of real risk. Jesus, asleep on that cushion, is a demonstration, not a performance, not a lesson being delivered. A life being lived out of a place of genuine rest, genuine trust, genuine surrender to the one who holds the wind and the water and every small boat crossing every dark sea. And tomorrow, or maybe even tonight, if you listen long enough to the quiet that rest is being offered to you, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have banished every fear or resolved every uncertainty before you are allowed to lay your head down. The invitation isn't to earn peace by achieving certainty. The invitation is to imitate, even imperfectly, even just a little, the posture of that sleeping figure in the stern. To take the weight of what you're carrying, the worry that has followed you into this night, the thing you have been turning over in your mind since you lay down, and to simply, gently hand it to someone who does not sleep, who watches, who holds, who is not surprised by what is coming, and to rest. The storm is almost here. In the next few minutes, Everything is going to change. But before it does, before the waves rise and the disciples panic and the moment of crisis arrives, I want you to hold on to this picture. A cushion in the stern of a boat. A man at rest. In the dark. On the water. Not because there is no danger, but because he knows, all the way down, that he is held. That is what trust looks like when it has grown deep enough. And maybe tonight, just a little, it can look like that for you too. It begins the way most difficult things begin. Not all at once. Not with a single dramatic moment that you can point to later and say, there. That was it. That was the moment everything changed. It begins gradually. The way a quiet evening can shift into something else without anyone quite noticing the exact moment the shift occurred. The first sign is the wind. It changes direction. Not dramatically, not the kind of gust that would make a seasoned fisherman look up immediately with alarm. Just a subtle rotation. A shift in the texture of the air. The way the sail fills slightly differently than it did a few minutes ago. Peter might have noticed it first. Or perhaps it was James, one of the men who had grown up reading this particular body of water, whose body had learned to register changes in the sea the way the rest of us register changes in someone's tone of voice. A slight tightening in the chest. A heightened attention. Nothing yet to act on. Just a noticing. Then the stars begin to disappear. Not all of them. Just the ones near the horizon. Swallowed one by something moving in from the hills to the north. The night sky over the Sea of Galilee is wide and generous on a clear evening. The kind of sky that makes the world feel enormous and open. That reminds you there is more to existence than the small circle of your daily concerns. But when clouds begin to move in from the hills, they come quickly, and the narrowing of the visible sky is one of the first things you notice. The open, star-filled expanse above the boat begins to close like a slowly shutting door. Someone says something low to someone else. A rope is adjusted. The sail is watched more carefully. And still, in the stern, Jesus sleeps. I want to walk slowly through what happens next, because I think the Bible's description of this storm is often read too quickly, too dramatically, as if it were a Hollywood sequence with swelling music and crashing waves and terror arriving in a single cinematic rush. But I don't think that is quite how it happens, either in the text or in the lived experience of the people on that boat. Fear rarely arrives like a wave breaking over the side all at once. It more often seeps in slowly, the way water finds its way through a small crack, so gradually that by the time you realize how wet you are, it has been coming in for a while already. The disciples are experienced sailors. They do not panic at the first sign of changing weather. They adjust. They compensate. They do the things they know how to do. Tighten this. Loosen that. Read the water. Manage the sail. Communicate with the other boats somewhere in the dark nearby. For a time, their skill and their experience are enough to keep the fear at a manageable distance. They are busy. And busyness, as many of us know, is an excellent short-term strategy for avoiding the feeling that things are moving beyond your control. But the sea does not cooperate with their busyness. The waves begin to build, not the gentle swells of a calm crossing, but something with weight and intention behind them. Water that hits the hull and does not simply slide away but pushes, insists, makes the boat shudder in a way that communicates something new. The wind is no longer a shift, a rotation, a thing to be adjusted for. It is arriving from everywhere at once, the way it does when the geography of the Galilee hills funnels weather down onto the surface of the water from multiple directions simultaneously. The sail becomes less a tool and more a problem. The ropes are taut with something that is pulling harder than they should be. Water begins to come over the side. Not a flood. Not yet. Just the first cold intrusions of a sea that has decided, in its impersonal way, that the boundaries between itself and this small wooden boat are negotiable. A wash of spray, then another, then a genuine surge that leaves the bottom of the boat noticeably wetter than it was a moment ago. And this is when the fear moves from the edges to the center. I want to stay with the disciples in this moment, because I think they deserve more than the quick summary we sometimes give them. They panicked. They woke Jesus. He calmed the storm. End of story. That telling is technically accurate, but it misses something important about the texture of what fear actually feels like from the inside. These are men who have known fear before. They are not strangers to difficult crossings, to moments on the water that required all their skill and focus and nerve. They have been cold and wet and exhausted on this sea before and found their way through it. They are not fragile men. They are not men who frighten easily, which means that when they become truly afraid on this crossing, it is not because they are weak. It is because what they are experiencing has genuinely exceeded what their skill and experience can manage. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from inexperience, but from the opposite, from knowing enough to understand that this situation is beyond what you can handle on your own. The beginner might not know enough to be properly afraid. The expert knows exactly what the instruments are telling him. And that is precisely why the fear is so specific and so real. The disciples know this sea. They know what a manageable storm looks like. They know what it feels like when conditions are difficult but survivable. And what they are experiencing now is crossing a line into different territory. The kind of territory where experience and skill and effort are still necessary, but no longer sufficient. The boat is filling. The waves are not relenting. And somewhere in the back of the mind of every man on that boat, a thought is forming that none of them wants to say out loud. Because saying it out loud would make it more real than any of them are ready for. We might not make it. There is something I want to name here, gently, because I think it speaks to something many of us carry into our nights. There is a particular shame that comes with being afraid of something you think you should be able to handle. The disciples were fishermen. The sea was their domain, their profession, the thing they knew better than almost anything else. And now the sea is winning, and they are afraid. And there is something almost humiliating about that being mastered by the very thing you have spent your life mastering. It introduces a secondary suffering alongside the primary one. Not just the fear of the storm, but the shame of being afraid of it. I think this is an experience that a great many people recognize, even if they would not describe it in those terms. The person who has always been the strong one in their family, lying awake with anxiety they cannot name, ashamed to tell anyone because strength is the role they have always played. The parent who is afraid for their child in ways they cannot protect against, carrying that fear privately because admitting it feels like a failure of the composure that parenting seems to require. The person who has practiced their faith for years, who has read the verses about peace and trust and the casting of anxieties, and who still cannot seem to sleep, and who wonders in the dark, alone, if that inability means something is wrong with them, something broken or deficient or lacking in real faith. The disciples on that boat know their trade, and they are afraid anyway. And that is not a contradiction. That is just the honest truth of being human in the face of something that exceeds you. Fear is not a sign of insufficient faith. Fear is a sign of being alive, of caring about things, of having enough perception to recognize genuine danger when it arrives. The question the story is asking is not, why are you afraid? The question which comes later, quietly, from the lips of Jesus, is a different and more interesting one. But we will get there. For now, the disciples are afraid. And they are not wrong to be afraid. And the fact that they are afraid does not diminish them. Think about your own nights. For a moment, think about the way fear tends to arrive not at noon, when there are things to do and people to talk to and the ordinary busyness of the day to push it back to the margins, but at night, when the busyness stops and the quiet arrives, and suddenly there is nothing between you and the thing you have been avoiding thinking about all day. The 2 a.m. moments. The moments when you lie there and the darkness seems to press in, and the mind, left without distraction, begins to do the thing it does, going over the same territory again and again, looking for an exit that isn't there, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened, imagining futures that may never arrive. The disciples' storm is happening on the Sea of Galilee, in a boat, with actual water and actual wind. Your storm might look different. It might be a medical report you are waiting for, a relationship that is fraying in ways you don't know how to stop, a financial situation that has become genuinely frightening, a grief that you thought you had moved through, but that has returned without warning, with all its original weight. A fear about someone you love, their choices, their safety, their future that you cannot fix no matter how much you think about it. The geography is different. The feeling is the same. The water is coming over the side. The waves are bigger than you know how to handle. And everything you know how to do, every skill and strategy and coping mechanism you have, is not quite enough to make you feel safe. And this is the moment, not in triumph, not in calm certainty, but in genuine desperation that the disciples go to Jesus. They do not go to him with a composed, carefully worded request. They do not approach him the way you might approach a person of authority, with a formal petition. They shake him awake. And their words, in the various gospel accounts, have the raw edge of real fear in them. Mark records it this way: "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care?" There is so much in those 3 words. There is fear, obviously. But underneath the fear, there is something that sounds almost like accusation, a confusion that has curdled slightly into hurt. We are out here. We are fighting this. And you are asleep. Don't you see what is happening? Don't you know what we are going through? Don't you care? I want to be honest with you. I think almost everyone who has ever prayed in the dark has prayed something close to this. Not in those exact words. Perhaps. Not with that exact texture. But the underlying question, the "don't you see?" Don't you care? Where are you in all of this? Now, that question lives in the honest prayers of a great many people who love God and are still afraid and cannot quite make the fear stop. And here's what I find remarkable about this story. Jesus does not rebuke them for asking. He does not respond to the "don't you care?" with a correction, with a lecture about the impropriety of questioning divine concern. He wakes up. He addresses the storm. And then, gently, he asks them a question in return. But the question comes after the calm, not before. He meets their desperation before he addresses their theology. That matters. That matters quite a lot. But we are not quite there yet. Because before Jesus speaks, there is a moment that I think deserves its own attention. The moment between the disciples reaching him and what happens next. The moment of being heard. Of having turned, finally, from managing the situation on their own to going to the one place where something real might happen. That moment of turning is not nothing. Even before the wind stops, even before the water stills, the turning itself, the reaching out, the waking him, the "don't you care?" is a moment of faith. Imperfect, frightened, slightly accusatory faith, but faith nonetheless. Because they could have kept bailing. They could have kept fighting the waves with everything they had. Proud and exhausted, right up until the water won. Instead, they went to him. And sometimes, that is the whole of what is asked. Not that you stop being afraid. Not that you compose yourself into an appropriate spiritual posture before you approach. Not that you have the right words, or the right theology, or the right level of peace before you are allowed to turn toward the one who is in the boat with you. Just that you turn. The storm is still raging. The water is still coming over the side. But a hand has reached out in the dark and found a shoulder. And a voice has spoken. And something that was asleep is about to wake up. And everything is about to change. he wakes up. That is the first thing. Before anything else happens, before the wind stops, before the waves settle, before the disciples catch their breath, Jesus wakes up. He opens his eyes. He takes in the situation around him, the water in the bottom of the boat, the straining of the hull, the wind pressing from every direction, the faces of the men who have just shaken him out of sleep with fear written plainly across their features. He sees all of it, and then he stands. I want you to picture that for a moment, because I think we often skip over it in our hurry to get to the miracle. Standing up in a small boat in the middle of a storm is not a simple or elegant thing. The deck beneath his feet is wet and moving, pitching with the swells, tilting with the weight of water that has already come aboard. The wind is loud, not a dramatic movie score kind of loud, but the real, physical loudness of weather that has mass and force behind it. Weather that presses against your body and makes it difficult to hear the person standing next to you. The other boats that set out with them are somewhere in the dark, managing their own emergencies. And Jesus stands up, not bracing himself, not gripping the mast for stability with the white-knuckled tension of a man trying to hold himself together against a force that frightens him. He stands the way a person stands in their own living room, with the ease of someone for whom the surface beneath their feet, however unstable it appears to everyone else, is fundamentally and completely familiar ground. And then he speaks to the storm. Mark's gospel records the words in a way that I find almost unbearably simple. He says, "Quiet. Be still." 2 words in most English translations. In the original Greek, it is similarly spare a command to silence, a command to stillness, delivered to wind and water the way you might deliver them to a room that has gotten too loud. Not a long prayer, not a formal invocation, not a careful theological formula. Just quiet. Be still. And the wind stopped, and the water became completely calm. I have read this passage more times than I can count, and there is still something about that sequence, the command, and then the immediate response that stops me every time. Not because I am skeptical of it, but because of what it says about the relationship between the one who speaks and the thing that obeys. The wind and the water do not argue. They do not negotiate. They do not comply reluctantly, the way a stubborn child might eventually do what they are told after a prolonged standoff. They simply stop, as if they had been waiting for the word, as if, in some way that goes deeper than physics or meteorology or anything we have language for, the created world recognizes the voice of the one through whom it was created, and responds the way any created thing responds to its maker's intention. Quiet. Be still. And the waters remembered peace. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment. The waters remembered peace, because it is not the Bible's language exactly. It is mine. But I think it describes something true about what happens in that moment. There is a kind of stillness that is merely the absence of noise. The storm stops, the wind drops, and what you are left with is just quiet, the neutral. Empty, quiet, of nothing happening. That is one kind of stillness. But what the disciples experience in the moments after Jesus speaks is something different. I think something that the gospel writers struggle to fully capture with ordinary language, which is perhaps why Mark adds the detail that the sea became completely calm, not just calmer, not just manageable, but completely, utterly, perfectly still. The Greek word used suggests a great calm, a stillness beyond what would naturally follow from a storm simply ceasing. As if the sea did not merely stop being violent, but actively became peaceful, returned to something that was its proper and original state. The way a thing returns to its nature when the force that had disrupted it is removed. The waters remembered peace, and in that remembered peace, the disciples stand in a boat that has stopped moving, on a surface that has become glass, under a sky that is, I imagine, beginning to clear at the edges. The clouds pulling back to reveal the stars that had been hidden. And they are. The text tells us, terrified, not relieved, not immediately joyful, terrified. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. I think that terror is important, and I don't want to rush past it. We sometimes read this story and assume that the disciples' fear in the aftermath of the miracle is simply a residual trembling from the storm, the nervous system's delayed response to danger. The body still flooded with adrenaline that hasn't quite received the signal that the emergency is over. And perhaps that is part of it. But I think it is something more than that. I think the terror they experience after the calming is a different kind of fear from the terror they experienced during the storm, and that the difference between those two fears is one of the most important things this story is trying to show us. The fear during the storm was the fear of people who are in danger from something much bigger and more powerful than themselves. It was the fear of the body, the fear of survival, the fear that has been woven into human experience since the beginning. It was understandable. It was human. It was the fear that says, "I might not survive this." The fear after the calming is something else entirely. It is the fear, if we can even call it fear, that arises when you find yourself in the presence of something that is not just more powerful than the storm, but of a categorically different order from anything you have previously encountered. The storm was frightening because it was big. But what just happened is frightening because the disciples are groping for the word, for the category, for the theological framework. It is not just bigger than the storm. It is the kind of thing that makes the storm look small. The kind of thing that has authority over the storm the way the storm had authority over the boat. Who is this? That question is not rhetorical. It is real. These men have been walking with Jesus, listening to Jesus, following Jesus for some time now. They have seen him heal people. They have heard him teach in ways that astonished crowds and silenced religious scholars. They thought they had some sense of who he was, some working understanding of what it meant to follow this particular rabbi from Nazareth. And now they are standing in a boat on a surface that was, 30 seconds ago, a storm. and the storm stopped because he told it to. Who is this? The question hangs in the night air over the Sea of Galilee. And in some ways, it is still hanging. It is the question that every person who seriously encounters Jesus eventually has to answer for themselves, in their own time, in their own storm. But before we get to that question, before we sit with what it means that the disciples are now more afraid of the calm than they were of the storm, I want to go back to the moment of transition itself, the moment between the roaring and the silence. Because I think that moment contains something that I do not want us to move past too quickly. When Jesus speaks and the storm stops, there is a transition, an instant, a breath, a heartbeat between one state and the other, between the noise and the silence, between the violence and the peace, between the boat full of terrified fishermen and the boat full of terrified fishermen standing in impossible stillness on glass-flat water. What does that moment feel like? I think it feels like the first full breath you take after crying for a long time. The one where your body, which has been held tight with emotion, suddenly releases, and the breath comes in deep and slow and reaches places in your chest that you had forgotten were there. It is not yet joy. It is not yet understanding. It is the simple, physical, overwhelming relief of something stopping, of the thing that was too much suddenly being over. Or perhaps it feels like the moment in the early hours of the morning when, after hours of lying awake, turning something over and over in your mind, something inside you simply releases. You don't solve the problem. You don't figure out the answer. You just let go of it. Suddenly, the way a hand opens without deciding to, and the tension goes out of your body, and the bed, which has felt like a difficult place all night, suddenly feels like what it actually is, something soft, holding you. Peace is not always the absence of the problem. Sometimes peace is the presence of someone whose authority over the problem is so complete that the problem simply cannot maintain its grip anymore. The storm didn't just stop. It was told to stop, and it obeyed. And in that obedience is a kind of revelation that the disciples are only beginning to process, standing there in the sudden silence, trembling with something that is more than fear, and more than relief, and more than wonder, though it is all of those things at once. Now I want to turn this gently towards something that I think is the heart of what this passage offers to anyone listening in the dark tonight. We talk a lot in the Christian life about praying for peace, asking God to take away the anxiety, to still the storm, to make the difficult thing resolve itself into something manageable. And that is a legitimate prayer. The disciples' prayer, "Don't you care if we drown?" is exactly that kind of prayer. And Jesus responds to it. But I want to offer a slightly different angle on what this miracle is actually showing us, because I think it is richer and stranger and more helpful than the simple version sometimes suggests. The storm, when Jesus speaks to it, does not simply diminish. It does not gradually ease off, the way a storm naturally would as it moves through and expends its energy. It stops completely, immediately, in response to a word. And the sea that follows is not merely calmer, it is completely still. The word used in the gospel suggests a stillness beyond what circumstances alone could produce. A peace that is, in the most literal sense, beyond natural explanation. This is a peace that is given, not achieved. This is a peace that comes from the presence and the word of someone whose authority over the created world is complete. And the disciples, standing in it, are discovering for the first time in their bodies, not just in their theology, what it means to be in the presence of that kind of authority. The peace that Jesus speaks into the storm is the same peace that he offers, in a different register, to the human heart. Peace I leave with you, he tells his disciples later in another gospel. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. The world's peace is circumstantial. It depends on conditions being right, dangers being absent, things working out. The peace that Jesus gives is of a different order. It is the peace of the stern of the boat, the peace of the cushion, the peace of genuine rest in the presence of genuine danger, held by someone whose authority over the danger is complete. You do not have to wait for your storm to stop to have access to that peace. That is the harder, stranger, more challenging truth that this passage is reaching toward. The miracle is real. The storm stops. The sea calms. The disciples are saved. But the deeper miracle, the one that Jesus seems to be pointing toward when he gently questions their fear, is the possibility of the stern of the boat peace even while the storm is still raging. The peace that is not dependent on circumstances resolving, but on presence, on the knowledge, bone deep and unhurried, that the one who can speak to the storm is in the boat with you. The disciples stand in the sudden, impossible stillness, and they ask each other, "Who is this?" And the stars are coming back out above the Sea of Galilee. And the water is flat and silver and perfectly still, reflecting what light there is in gentle, unbroken ripples that are barely ripples at all. And the other boats, somewhere in the dark, have survived their own version of the crossing. And the shore they are heading toward is still there, waiting, as it has been all along. Nothing about the journey has changed. They still have miles to cross. The night is still dark. The things that were waiting for them on the other side are still waiting. The questions and the challenges and the ordinary difficulties of the life they are living together, none of those have been resolved by this moment on the water. But something has shifted. Something fundamental. Something below the level of circumstance and situation and the daily reckoning of difficulty. Something in the category of, who is in this boat with us? And what does that mean about what is possible? They do not yet have the words for it. The words will come later, slowly, over years of continued following and failing, and finding their way back to him. The full understanding of who he is will take much longer to arrive than this one night on a storm-stilled sea. But they have felt it, in their bodies, in the silence, in the stillness of the water under their feet. They have felt what it is like to be in the presence of someone whose word carries authority over the things that frighten them most. And that feeling, however imperfectly understood, however incompletely processed, is the beginning of the kind of trust that can, eventually, sleep on a cushion in a storm. Tonight, whatever the water looks like around you, let the stillness of this moment rest on you for a little while. The storm has been spoken to. The peace has been given. The waters have remembered what they are, in the presence of the one who made them. And you are in the boat, and he is in it with you. Be still. The water is still. The wind has stopped. The boat is no longer pitching and shuddering beneath their feet. The ropes that were pulled taut against the force of the storm hang loose now, swaying gently with the kind of motion that belongs to calm water, not crisis. The disciples' hands, which have been gripping things for the last however many minutes, holding on, compensating, managing, fighting, have nothing left to fight. And in the quiet that follows, Jesus asks them a question, not a statement, not a reassurance, not a gentle word of comfort designed to smooth over what just happened and move everyone along. A question. Two questions. Actually, depending on which gospel account you read, and the accounts are slightly different in their wording, which tells me that the disciples who remembered this moment and eventually passed it on each heard it slightly differently. The way people who experience something significant together often remember the same moment through the particular filter of what it meant to them personally. Mark records it this way: "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Luke softens it slightly. "Where is your faith?" Matthew frames it as a statement that contains a question. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Different angles on the same thing. The same thing being, something is missing here. Something that should have been present and wasn't. And I want you to think about what that something is. I want to be very careful with how I handle this question, because I think it is one of the most misread moments in the entire story. For a long time, in a certain kind of Christian teaching, this question was used as a kind of rebuke evidence that the disciples had failed a test, that their fear during the storm was a spiritual deficiency, that the correct response to a life-threatening situation on the water would have been to remain calm and untroubled because they had Jesus with them and should have known better. This reading turns the question into an accusation and turns the disciples into cautionary examples of inadequate faith, and implicitly suggests to anyone listening who has ever been afraid in the middle of a storm, real or metaphorical, that their fear is evidence of something wrong with them spiritually. I do not think that is what Jesus is doing here. I think the question is something much gentler, much more interesting, and much more useful than that. Think about how a question works when it is asked by someone who genuinely loves you. A question in the hands of someone who cares about you is not primarily an instrument of judgment. It is an instrument of invitation. It does not say, "You have failed, and here is the evidence." It says, "Come here. Sit down. Let's look at this together. Let's understand what happened. Let's see if there is something you are carrying that you don't have to carry. Some weight you have taken on that was never meant to be yours. Why were you afraid? That is not a dismissal of the fear. It is not a suggestion that the fear was silly or irrational or beneath someone of proper faith. The storm was real. The water in the bottom of the boat was real. The waves and the wind were real. Jesus does not pretend otherwise. He does not look around at the now calm sea and say, "See, there was never anything to worry about." He knows there was something to worry about. He knows the sea. He knows what a storm on the Galilee can do to a small wooden vessel. The question is not, why did you notice the storm? The question is, why, in the middle of the storm, did you forget that I was here? That is a different question entirely, and it changes everything. Let me try to put it another way. Imagine you are a child, and you are afraid of the dark. And one night there is a power outage, and the house goes completely black, and you are in your room and you cannot see anything, and the sounds that the house makes at night, the creaking, the settling, all the ordinary nocturnal vocabulary of an old building suddenly seems sinister and close and frightening, and you are genuinely afraid. Your heart is racing. The darkness feels like it has weight. And then your father opens the door and comes in and sits on the edge of your bed. And after a while, after you have calmed down a little, after the warmth of his presence has done, what presence does he ask you? Gently, what were you afraid of? He is not asking because he thinks you were foolish to be afraid. He is not asking to compile evidence of your failures. He is asking because he wants you to understand something, to trace the path of the fear back to its source, to look at it in the light of his presence and see it more clearly than you could see it when you were alone in the dark. He is asking because love does not want you to carry fear that you don't have to carry. He is asking because the answer to the question might help you find your way to a place where the next power outage is a little less terrifying, not because the dark will be any less dark, but because something will have shifted in your understanding of what is true when the lights go out. Why were you afraid? It is a father's question, a shepherd's question, the question of someone who has been watching you navigate something difficult and who, now that the immediate crisis has passed, wants to sit with you in the aftermath and help you understand what you were actually dealing with and what you had with you all along, even when you couldn't see it clearly. So let's try to answer it honestly. Why were the disciples afraid? The surface answer is obvious. Because there was a storm. And the storm was dangerous. And they were on a small boat in the middle of it. But Jesus is asking something beneath the surface answer. He is asking about the logic of their fear, about what the fear was built on. What assumption it was making about their situation that led them to the terror they experienced. And I think the honest answer is this. They were afraid because in the middle of the storm, they forgot he was there. Not factually. They knew he was in the boat. They could, presumably, see him asleep in the stern. But there is a difference between knowing something as a fact and knowing it as a living reality that shapes how you experience your situation. The disciples knew Jesus was in the boat the way you might know, intellectually, that a thing is true without that truth having any real traction on your emotional state. The knowledge was there, but it wasn't connected to anything. It wasn't changing how they felt. Their fear was operating on the assumption that they were essentially alone in their emergency, that the resources available to them were the resources they could see and measure and deploy their own skill, their own strength, their own experience with the sea. And when those resources proved insufficient, they arrived at despair because there was nothing left in the inventory. But they were not alone. They were never alone. And the one who was with them was not an additional resource in the inventory, another skill set, another pair of hands on the ropes. He was something categorically different. He was the one in whose presence storms are not the most powerful thing in the room. They forgot that. And the forgetting is what Jesus is gently, lovingly pointing to. Where is your faith? I want to spend a moment on that word faith, because I think it is one of the most misunderstood words in the Christian vocabulary. And the misunderstanding matters particularly in this moment. Faith, in the way it is sometimes taught, sounds like a kind of emotional achievement, a state of feeling confident and assured and untroubled, which you are supposed to maintain through an act of disciplined will. In this understanding, faith is the opposite of fear. And if you have enough of the one, you will not experience the other, which means that if you are afraid, it is evidence that you have not achieved sufficient faith. And the solution is to try harder, to feel more certain, to push the doubt down, to maintain a positive spiritual disposition in the face of circumstances that are objectively frightening. I do not think this is what Jesus means by faith. And I think the disciples' experience in this story demonstrates why that understanding of faith is both unhelpful and not quite true to what the scriptures are actually describing. Faith, in the Hebrew and Greek understanding that runs through the Bible, is not primarily a feeling. It is not a state of emotional certainty. It is, at its root, a matter of orientation of where you are turned, what you are looking toward, what or whom you are trusting to be the ground beneath your feet when everything else is shifting. The disciples had fear and faith both available to them in that boat. The storm was real enough to justify fear. Jesus was present enough to justify trust. Both things were true simultaneously. The question, where is your faith, is not asking, why do you have any fear at all? It is asking, in this moment, what are you oriented toward? What is the thing you are trusting to tell you the truth about your situation? Is it the storm? Or is it me? Faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is choosing, in the presence of fear, to orient yourself toward the one whose word is more reliable than the storms. And now I want to turn this very gently toward you. Because this question, why were you afraid? Where is your faith? Does not stay on the Sea of Galilee in the 1st century. It travels. It crosses every ocean and every century and arrives quietly in the particular night you are in right now. What is the storm that is making it hard to sleep? You know what it is. You have probably been thinking about it since you lay down. It has a shape, a texture, a particular way of presenting itself to your mind in the quiet hours when there is nothing to distract you from it. It may be one large thing, or it may be many smaller things, braided together into something that feels heavier than any single thread. But it is there, and it has been talking to you. And what it has been saying, in its particular and persuasive way, is some version of this. You are essentially alone in this. And the resources available to you are the resources you can see and measure. And those resources may not be enough. That is the storm's argument. That is always the storm's argument. And it is very convincing in the dark. At 2 in the morning, when you are tired and your defenses are down, and the thing you are worried about feels very close and very real. And into that argument, gently. Not as a rebuke, but as a question, an invitation. An open door comes this: where is your faith? Not, stop being afraid. Not, your fear is a failure. Not, you should be ashamed of how you feel right now. Just, where are you looking? What are you trusting to tell you the truth about your situation? Is it only the storm? Or is there something else, someone else, whose presence in this boat changes what the storm can actually do? The question Jesus asks his disciples is not a question that demands an immediate, perfect answer. It is a question that is meant to stay with them, to live in them, to do its slow work over time, to gradually reorient the way they understand their situation every time a storm arrives. And it does stay with them for the rest of their lives, as far as we can tell from the record that survives. These men carry this moment with them. The night on the Sea of Galilee does not make them fearless. They will be afraid again of other storms, of other kinds of danger, of the enormous and terrifying events that will unfold in the years ahead. But something has shifted. They have felt what it is like to have the storm spoken to. They have experienced in their bodies, and not just their theology, what the presence of Jesus in the boat actually means. And the question, why were you afraid? Where is your faith? Is now inside them, living there, doing what good questions do, which is to slowly change the way you see. Tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are, the question arrives again, not as an accusation, as an invitation. Why are you afraid? What is the storm telling you that you need to examine more carefully? What assumption is the fear making about your situation, about whether you are alone in it? About whether the resources available to you are only the ones you can see? And where is your faith? Not where should it be? Ideally, in some perfected future version of yourself. But where is it right now? Tonight? In the actual condition you are in? And is there even the smallest possibility of turning it just a few degrees? Just enough to catch a glimpse of the figure in the stern. The one who is still there, who has always been there. Whose presence in this boat is the most important fact about your current situation? You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to banish the fear before you are allowed to trust. The disciples trusted and feared simultaneously, and Jesus answered them anyway. The turning doesn't have to be complete. It just has to be genuine. Turn toward the one who asked the question. He is not asking it from a distance. We have come a long way together tonight. We began at dusk, on the shore of an ancient sea, with the smell of fish and evening air, and the particular quiet that settles over a working harbor when the day's labor is finally done. We watched a group of tired men climb into a boat at the end of a long day, each of them carrying things that were invisible to the eye, but no less real for that: worries, questions, exhaustion, the particular weight of a life being lived in uncertain times. We watched Jesus walk to the stern, settle himself against a cushion, and close his eyes. We watched the storm arrive. We stood with the disciples in the rising water and the pressing wind and the specific, body-level terror of being in over your head on a dark sea. We felt the texture of their fear, not the simplified, cartoonish version of it, but the real thing, the kind that arrives not because you are weak or faithless, but because you are human, and the thing in front of you is genuinely bigger than what you can handle on your own. We heard them cry out. We heard the question underneath the crying out, "Don't you care?" Which is the oldest question in the human repertoire, the one that every honest person eventually asks when the night gets long enough and the storm gets loud enough. And we watched the storm stop. We stood in the impossible stillness that followed and felt, even at this distance of 2,000 years, something of what the disciples felt, that trembling, awed, not quite terrified, not quite joyful state that comes from being in the presence of something so far beyond your categories that your usual emotional vocabulary simply isn't adequate to the moment. And we sat with the question that Jesus left in the air over the quiet water. Why were you afraid? Where is your faith? And we tried to hear it not as a rebuke, but as what it actually is. An invitation to look more carefully at what is true about our situation, to see past the storm to the one who is in the boat with us. Now we have arrived at the last part of the story. In the last part, I want to tell you, is not about what happened on the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago. The last part is about tonight. Wherever you are right now, whatever room you are lying in, whatever city is quiet outside your window, whatever particular darkness surrounds you at this hour, I want you to know that this story was told tonight for you specifically. Not for some general, abstract audience. For you. For the person who is still awake when they would rather be asleep. For the person whose mind has been running its familiar loops of worry, rehearsing the same fears in slightly different arrangements. trying to find by thinking what cannot actually be found that way. For the person who is tired in a way that goes deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of tired that sleep alone doesn't fully fix, because the weight you are carrying isn't located in your muscles and your bones, but somewhere more interior in the part of you that has been managing and compensating and holding it together for so long that you have almost forgotten what it feels like to simply put the weight down. This story was told for you. Let me ask you something, and I want you to take a moment with it rather than answering quickly. What did you bring onto the boat tonight? The disciples, when they climbed into that vessel at the end of a long day, each brought something invisible with them. We talked about that at the beginning, the unspoken worries, the questions that didn't have answers yet, the weariness of men who had given a great deal of themselves and didn't quite know what to do with what remained. They didn't announce these things. They didn't lay them out for inspection. They just carried them, the way we carry the things we carry quietly, automatically, because we have been carrying them so long that we barely notice the weight anymore until we try to set it down and realize how much lighter we feel without it. What is the thing you have been carrying today? Maybe it is a fear about someone you love, a child, a parent, a friend, and the specific helplessness of caring deeply about someone whose situation you cannot fix. No matter how much you think about it or plan or worry, maybe it is a fear about your own life, a decision that needs to be made, a direction that isn't clear, a sense that you are standing at a crossroads in the dark, and you cannot quite make out which road leads where. Maybe it is grief, the quiet, persistent kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply lives in you, coloring everything a slightly different shade than it would be otherwise, surfacing most reliably in the quiet moments, the ones just like this one. Maybe it is something smaller and harder to name. The accumulated weight of 100 small stresses that individually seem manageable but together have created something that feels heavier than any of them should. The sense that you are perpetually slightly behind, slightly inadequate, slightly not enough, and that tonight, like most nights, you have arrived at the end of the day without having quite caught up. Whatever it is, take a moment and acknowledge it. Not to analyze it further. Not to try to solve it one more time before you sleep. Just to see it clearly. To name it honestly. To stop pretending it isn't there. It is there. And it is okay that it is there. And you have been carrying it faithfully. And now, I want to suggest something. You can put it down. Not permanently. I am not promising you that tomorrow the thing will be gone. That the fear will have evaporated. That the difficulty will have resolved itself overnight into something easy. I am not that kind of storyteller. And this is not that kind of story. The disciples got back into boats after this night. They faced other storms. The crossing that followed the calming was not a crossing into a life without difficulty, without fear, without the ordinary human experience of things being hard and uncertain and sometimes genuinely frightening. But for tonight, just for these next few hours, just for the length of a night's sleep, you can put it down. Because here is what this story has been building toward. The thing it has been trying to show you from the moment we first heard about the cushion in the stern of the boat. He is still in the boat. Whatever is happening in your life right now, whatever storm is building or raging or slowly exhausting itself on the horizon of your particular circumstances, he is in the boat with you. Not in some abstract, theological sense that you are supposed to affirm intellectually while not quite feeling its reality. In the actual, present, immediate sense of a presence that is genuinely here, genuinely aware of what you are going through. Genuinely. This is the word that matters, genuinely. Not asleep to your situation, even when everything around you seems to suggest otherwise. He is awake. He sees the water in the bottom of the boat. He knows what the wind has been doing. He is aware of how long you have been managing, how much energy you have spent trying to keep everything afloat, how tired you are in the way that tired people are tired when they have been working against something for a long time without rest. He sees all of it, and he is still here. I want to return one more time to that image of Jesus asleep on the cushion, because I think it is the image this whole story wants to leave you with. More than the miracle, more than the question, more than anything else. Not because the sleeping Jesus is the final word. The final word in this story is the speaking Jesus, the one who stands and commands the storm and reveals something about himself that the disciples are only beginning to process. That is real. That matters enormously. But the sleeping Jesus comes first. And the sleeping Jesus is, in a strange and beautiful way, an invitation. He is sleeping because he trusts completely. He is sleeping because somewhere below the level of consciousness and effort and management, there is a rest available to him that is rooted not in the absence of danger, but in the presence of the one who holds all things. He is sleeping the way a child sleeps in the arms of someone who loves them, not because the world is perfectly safe, but because this particular set of arms is a kind of safety that the world cannot take away. And that rest that deep, ungrasping, genuinely released rest is what he is offering you tonight. Not as a command, not as a standard you are supposed to achieve before you are allowed to sleep, but as a gift, as an invitation, as a small, quiet, completely genuine possibility that tonight, even with all that you are carrying, even with all that remains unresolved, you might close your eyes and sleep the way he slept on that cushion. Not because your storm is over, but because he is in the boat. Here is what I want you to do. If you are willing, take a slow breath. Not a forced, effortful breath. Not the kind where you are trying to make yourself feel differently than you feel. Just a slow, natural breath. The kind that comes when you stop holding your chest so tight. Feel the surface beneath you, the mattress, the pillow, the specific, familiar weight and warmth of the place where you sleep. This is your boat. This is the vessel carrying you through tonight and into tomorrow. It may feel unstable sometimes. It may feel like the water is finding its way in, but it is still floating. It has carried you through every previous night, every previous storm, every previous version of this same fear, and it is carrying you still. And he is in it with you. You don't have to resolve the thing that is worrying you before you are allowed to sleep. You don't have to achieve peace through effort, manufacture calm through willpower, talk yourself out of the fear that is real and present and understandable. You just have to notice, one more time, that the thing this story has been quietly insisting on from the very beginning is still true. You are not alone in this crossing. The one who spoke to the storm is not far away, waiting at some distance to be petitioned from a great remove. He is here, in the boat. As close as the sleeping figure in the stern was to the terrified disciples in the bow, which is to say, not far at all. Within reach. Reachable by a touch, by a word, by the simplest and most honest cry of a heart that is tired of carrying what it is carrying. Let me speak very quietly now, because I think this is the moment for quiet. The story is almost over. The Sea of Galilee is still and silver behind us. The disciples are somewhere on the far shore, still trembling a little, still processing the question hanging in the air, still more astonished than they know how to handle. They will carry this night with them for the rest of their lives. It will come back to them in their own storms, the ones that come later, the ones that are harder and costlier and more complex than a night on a dark sea. And when those storms come, they will have this to return to, the memory of stillness, of a word spoken into chaos, of a presence that did not abandon them even when they thought it had. You have that too. Now, whatever else tonight has been, you have sat with this story long enough that some part of it has settled in you, not as information to be filed away, but as something more like memory, more like experience. Nine. More like the kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than just the mind. And what it knows is this: he is still in the boat. The wind may still be moving somewhere out at the edges of your night. The water may still be finding its way in small and persistent ways that require your attention tomorrow. The things that were hard before you lay down are still there, waiting patiently for morning. But morning will come. It always has. And between now and morning, you do not have to hold everything together by yourself. You do not have to stay awake managing the things that are beyond your management. You do not have to solve tonight what has not yet found its solution. You can, if you are willing just for tonight, just for these hours, do what he showed you was possible. Lying there in the stern with his head on a cushion in the middle of a crossing that was about to become a storm. You can trust the one who is awake when you are sleeping. You can release the grip on the things you have been holding. You can let your body, which has been doing so much, finally rest. So let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow to its nighttime rhythm, long and unhurried. In and out. The way breathing goes when the body is finally allowed to do what it is made to do. Let the thoughts that are still moving through your mind slow down and spread out and lose their urgency. The way waves lose their urgency when they finally reach the shore after a long journey across open water. Let the night hold you. Let the dark be what it actually is, not a threat, not an emptiness, but simply the hours in which you are asked to do nothing except receive the gift of rest. The sea is still tonight. The one who stilled it has not left the boat. And you tired, faithful, imperfect, beloved you, with all your unresolved fears and your honest questions, and your storms that are real, and your courage that is also real, you are allowed to sleep. You are safe. You are held. You are not alone on this crossing. Close your eyes. He is still here. Good night.